He thought it was just another harmless joke in a language she couldn't understand. He didn't know that in less than 5 minutes, that joke would cost him a $10 billion deal, and his reputation. And she, the black investor he mocked, she was about to answer him in perfect Spanish, and turn his entire world upside down. The room was all glass and money. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked over the city, the skyline glinting with the arrogance of steel and light. Cameras were set up. Assistants hovered at the edges. Lawyers shuffled contracts. Translators whispered into headsets. This was supposed to be a historic moment. $10 billion on the line. A mega deal between a global investment fund and one of the most powerful tech conglomerates in the world. At the center of it all sat Amara Johnson, a black investor in her late 30s, calm, composed, and focused. Her natural hair was pulled back into a sleek bun, and the dark blue of her suit matched the midnight sheen of the city outside. Opposite her sat Alejandro Velasco, the billionaire CEO. Late 40s. Smooth gray at his temples. Designer watch. Perfect smile. The kind of man who used charm like a weapon and money like armor. The world knew him as visionary, genius, philanthropist. His inner circle knew him as something else. Cameras weren't rolling yet. Microphones weren't standby. They were in that strange in-between. Not quite private, not quite public. Alejandro leaned back, turned his head slightly toward 2 of his board members on his right, and said in Spanish, quietly enough that he thought it was safe, loudly enough that it wasn't. Tranquilos. Dejen la sonrisa para las cámaras. Cuando el dinero entra. La mandemos a la mesa de los niños. Solo la necesitamos por la foto. Nadie la vieja tomar en serios. The man beside him chuckled. If you don't speak Spanish, let me tell you what he just said. Relax. Let her smile for the cameras. Once the money comes in, we'll send her to the kids' table. We only need her for the photo. No one is going to take her seriously. He smirked, pleased with himself. He really believed she didn't understand. He really believed he was untouchable. He had no idea that every word was about to be used against him, because Amara lifted her eyes, locked them on his, and, in flawless, steady Spanish, answered, Este seguro, Señor Velasco. Porque en mi version del contrato. Nadie me manda a la mesa de los niños. Y cuando escuchen lo que acaba de decir, dudo que alguien lo vuelva a tomar en serio a usted. Are you sure, Mr. Velasco? Because in my version of the contract, nobody sends me to the kids' table. And when they hear what you just said, I doubt anyone will ever take you seriously again. Silence. The board members froze. The translator's eyes went wide. One of the lawyers almost dropped his pen. You could feel the air crackle. And what happened next? That's the part nobody in that room will ever forget. But to really understand how one arrogant joke in Spanish ruined a $10 billion deal, we need to rewind. Before the lights, before the cameras, before the joke, there was a girl sitting at a kitchen table with a cheap dictionary and a stubborn dream. That girl was Amara. She grew up in a small apartment with thin walls and big expectations. Her mother, Gloria, worked double shifts at a hospital. Her father, Samuel, drove a taxi and took night classes. The TV was old. The fridge was noisy. But the bookshelf, that thing was packed. Languages, history, economics, religion, novels. If it had pages, it had a place in their home. Education, her mother used to say, stirring a pot of rice and beans, is the only passport they can't take from you. As a kid, Amara loved the way words felt in her mouth. She would sit at the table copying new ones from a Spanish phrasebook she found at a library sale. Mesa, she whispered once, tapping the wooden table. Table. Ventana, she whispered, pointing at the glass. Window. Her father laughed softly. One day, you'll be in some big office using that Spanish to negotiate millions, he joked. He had no idea how right he'd be. By high school, she was fluent in Spanish and well on her way with French. By college, she'd added a couple more languages to her arsenal. But the one thing she was always most fluent in, numbers. She didn't just see money. She saw patterns, systems, the way capital could destroy or build entire communities. While some people chased money to show off, Amara chased money to move things, to change things. to prove that a black woman from a tiny apartment could sit at the same tables people spent centuries keeping her away from. Years passed. She clawed her way through internships, grad school, and the brutally competitive world of finance. She spent countless nights in offices lit by screens showing markets in Tokyo, London, New York. She got used to being the only black woman in the room. The only woman, period. The only one whose voice people seemed surprised to hear. They underestimated her. They mispronounced her name. They assumed she was someone's assistant. And slowly, she learned something very important. When people underestimate you, they hand you power. Quiet power. The kind that doesn't show until you decide to use it. By her late 30s, she wasn't just working in finance anymore. She was a partner at Northbridge Capital, a global investment firm known for massive, strategic deals. She led a fund that specialized in tech and infrastructure in emerging markets. Her track record was so good that people who used to ignore her now begged for meetings. But she never forgot where she came from. She still called her mother every Sunday. She still sent money back home. And every time she walked into a marble lobby with her head up, a part of her walked in for that little girl at the kitchen table with the dictionary. On the morning our story really begins, Amora stood in front of her floor-to-ceiling windows in New York, coffee in hand, watching the city move. Her phone vibrated on the table. Mom flashed on the screen. She smiled and answered, putting her mother on speaker while she adjusted her earrings. "Hey, Ma." "Amora, are you eating properly?" her mother asked, skipping any greeting, as usual. "Good morning to you too," Amora laughed. "Yes, I'm eating. I've got a huge meeting today. I can't pass out from hunger in front of billionaires. That's bad for brand image." Her mother chuckled. "As long as you remember whose name you carry, not just your brand." "Always," Amora said softly, because that day was important. It was the day she and her team were finalizing the framework of what could become the biggest deal of her career. A $10 billion investment into Velasco Dynamics, a global tech conglomerate led by the legendary Alejandro Velasco. To the world, Velasco Dynamics was a miracle machine. AI, green tech, logistics, satellites. They were everywhere. They promised a smarter, cleaner future. To Amara, they were an opportunity and a risk. If the deal worked, it would mean influence, seats on the board, capital that could be directed into sustainable projects in underserved regions, jobs, infrastructure. If the deal went wrong, her reputation could implode. Billions could vanish. But at that moment, in her sleek office with its glass walls and quiet hum, it felt like things were finally aligning. Her colleague Lena Park, a brilliant analyst in her early 30s, knocked lightly and stepped in. "You ready to charm a billionaire?" Lena asked, half smiling, tablet in hand. "Charm? No," Amara replied with a grin. "Out-negotiate. Absolutely." They shared a quick laugh. It was their normal. Before everything unraveled. The first meeting with Alejandro's team wasn't in that glass room with cameras. It was in a boardroom a month earlier, with water jugs, not champagne, with laptops, not microphones. They had flown to Barcelona, Velasco Dynamics European headquarters, because Alejandro insisted on it. "If you want to know a man, see how he acts on home turf," Amara had told Lena on the plane. The boardroom was beautiful, wood, soft leather chairs, a view of the city. A dozen people sat around the table, lawyers, advisors, tech leads, 2 translators, and a few board members. Alejandro walked in last. "Señoras, señores," he greeted, spreading his arms like a performer. "Thank you for coming all this way. Ms. Johnson, it's an honor." He pronounced her name correctly. Strong handshake. Warm eye contact. Everything exactly as a PR manual would recommend. "Please, call me Amora," she replied. "Only if you call me Alejandro," he said with a wink, the room chuckling. On the surface, charming, disarming, inclusive. But here's the thing. People who are used to being underestimated develop a second kind of hearing. They hear words, and they also hear what's underneath them. The meeting went smoothly at first. Presentations, growth projections, charts, talks of synergy, expansion, shared values. On a break, while people drifted toward the coffee station and the big windows, something small happened. Tiny, easy to miss. Alejandro walked over to a knot of his executives. A few of them slipped into Spanish, assuming the foreign guests wouldn't notice. One of the board members, a tall man with silver hair, glanced back at Amora and said, in Spanish, "Por lo menos esta vez la cuota de diversidad viene con dinero de verdad." At least this time the diversity quota comes with real money. Soft laughter. It was quick, quiet. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody put it in minutes. Most people in that room didn't even flinch. But Amara heard it. Every syllable. Clear as a bell. She didn't react. Not outwardly. She just sipped her coffee, her face calm. Lena, standing next to her, noticed the slight tightening of Amara's jaw. "You okay?" Lena murmured. "I'm fine," Amara replied. Then, after a beat, "Just listening." You see, this was the first red flag. They didn't know she spoke Spanish. That alone told her something. They thought she was powerful enough to sign a $10 billion check, but not worth basic respect. And that tiny comment about diversity quota. It told her even more. They didn't just want her money. They wanted her image. The powerful, successful black woman investor. The headline for their next CSR report. The face on their "We Care About Diversity" poster. And for the first time, a thought slid quietly into Amara's mind. If this is what they are comfortable saying out loud, what are they comfortable hiding on paper? On the flight back from Barcelona, while most of the team slept, the city lights shrinking behind them, Amara sat with her seatbelt fastened and her mind racing. Lena lifted her sleep mask and peered over. "You're still thinking about it," she said. "About what?" Amara asked, though she knew. That comment. The diversity quota thing. Amara exhaled. "Maybe I'm overreacting." You ever do that? Something feels wrong, but you start gaslighting yourself before anyone else can. "You're not overreacting," Lena said quietly. It was disrespectful. "But the numbers are solid," Amara replied, staring at the laptop screen in front of her. "The projections, the infrastructure, the tech. If we walk away because someone said something stupid, we might be leaving a lot on the table. And opportunities like this don't come often." Lena hesitated. "You're not just someone in this deal. You're the deal." Amara smiled faintly at that, but it didn't erase the knot in her chest. Memories bubbled up. The professor in business school who once told her, "You're very articulate," like it was a surprise. The investor who assumed she was the assistant and handed her his empty coffee cup. The panel where she was introduced as a powerful female voice while every man was introduced by his achievements. Each time, she pushed it down, focused on the numbers, on the work. Her brain had been trained. Do not give them an excuse to say you're emotional. So now, when the voice inside her whispered, "Something is off," another voice shot back, "Don't make it about race. Don't be that person." She stared out at the clouds. "What if I'm reading too much into it?" she asked softly, more to herself than to Lena. Lena leaned back. "What if you're not?" And that's the line right there, isn't it? That thin line people of color walk all the time in professional spaces. If you speak up, you're sensitive. If you stay quiet, they keep stepping on you. Amara closed her eyes for a second and pictured her mother. "Remember who you are," she could almost hear Gloria saying. "Not who they want you to be." She opened her eyes again and made a decision. Not a loud one, not a dramatic one. Just a quiet choice. She wouldn't blow things up. She would pay attention. And that choice, right there, was the turning point. Because once you start paying attention, you start seeing everything. Over the next few weeks, negotiations intensified. Contracts flew back and forth. Red lines, clauses, side letters, financial models, risk assessments. At first glance, everything looked normal. But then little discrepancies started showing up. One day, Lena walked into Amara's office holding a thick stack of printed documents. "Got a minute?" she asked. "Always," Amara replied, rubbing her temples. Lena laid 2 copies of the same document on the desk. One was in English, one in Spanish. "These are supposed to be the same," Lena said. "Our legal team got the English version. Their local counsel sent the Spanish official version. I ran them through a translation tool just to cross-check. And there are differences." "Differences," Amara repeated, already feeling that knot tighten again. Lena pointed to a paragraph in the Spanish contract. Look at this clause about voting rights after the third funding round. In English, we keep a guaranteed minimum stake and 2 board seats. In Spanish, the wording creates a loophole. Under certain market conditions, they can propose a restructuring that effectively dilutes us and removes one of our seats. Amora's eyes darkened. Could be a drafting error, she said, even though part of her didn't believe it. Maybe, Lena answered. Or maybe they think nobody on our side reads Spanish well enough to notice. The room felt smaller suddenly. You know that feeling when your stomach drops, even though you're sitting still. That's what hit Amora. Because now it wasn't just about a rude comment or microaggression. Now it was about money, power, control. She picked up the Spanish version and began reading it herself, line by line, the way her father used to read the meter on the taxi, carefully, because every small change meant something. She saw it. A subtle word here. A different preposition there. Enough legal wiggle room to justify. Later. But that's what the contract says. What else? She asked, her voice steady. Lena swallowed. I also got copied on an email thread by accident. Their junior associate must have hit reply all instead of reply. It was in Spanish too. She passed her phone across the desk. Amora scrolled. There it was. Sign off bridge no nota la diferencia. Perfecto. One line said. Numbers aseguramos el control después del tercer año, y ella se cuida solo con la foto. If Northbridge doesn't notice the difference, perfect. We secure control after year 3 and she's left with just a photo. Just a photo. There it was again. The same pattern. Use her. Use her image. Use her name. Then push her aside. Another line made her jaw clench. Honestamente, dudo que ella lee los documentos y en español. Honestly, I doubt she reads the documents in Spanish. They were building an entire strategy on the assumption that she didn't understand. That she was there for prestige, not power. For optics, not substance. You can imagine how that felt. If you've ever worked twice as hard to be taken half as seriously, you know. Her heart pounded. But her mind went quiet. Not numb. Focused. Because now she knew 3 things. This wasn't an accident. They were underestimating her on purpose. That underestimation was her weapon. Let's talk about Alejandro Velasco for a moment. To the media, he was the golden boy of tech. Born to wealthy parents, educated in elite schools, turned a small software company into a global empire. He donated big to charity. Sat on panels about inclusion in tech. Took smiling photos with scholarship students. He knew the language of equality. He could say all the right words. But behind closed doors, his strategy was simple. Control everything. Never share real power. Use people for what they can give you. Then move them off the board. He didn't see himself as prejudiced. Men like him rarely do. He just believed some people were made to lead, and others were made to stand next to them in photos. In his mind, Amora was perfect. A black woman investor with a spotless record, public respect, and billions at her fingertips. She was an answer to his PR prayers. He could stand next to her at press conferences and talk about diverse partnerships. He could put her on the front page of their sustainability report. He could have her face on investor decks when approaching global funds who cared about ESG. And if the contracts worked the way he wanted, he could still retain full control and maneuver her fund out of the real decision-making later. That was the plan. He didn't rant. He didn't shout slares. He just quietly engineered an arrangement where she would be useful, until she wasn't. He believed he was smarter. He believed he was safer. He believed, above all, that nobody would catch him. Because after all, who was going to question him? The woman who didn't even read Spanish? He had no idea he was building his own downfall. Back in New York, the mood at Northbridge shifted. In a closed-door meeting, Amora gathered her core team. Lena, the head of legal, Marcus, and one of the senior partners, Evelyn Shaw, who had mentored her for years. Evelyn was in her 60s, white-haired, sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who had survived many chapters of the financial world and carried the scars to prove it. On the screen at the front of the room, Lena projected the side-by-side comparison of the English and Spanish contracts. Marcus walked them through the legal implications. Lena broke down the email thread. When they were done, the room went silent. "Well," Evelyn said finally, fingers steepled. "That's not a mistake. That's intent. So what do we do?" Marcus asked. "We can walk away. Quietly. Say the terms weren't favorable." Everyone looked at Amora. That's the thing about leadership. Sometimes you wish someone else would decide, but the room always turns to you. Amora stared at the screen, at her own name in the draft contracts, at the numbers. $10 billion. She thought about the jobs this could create, infrastructure in communities that had been ignored, projects in places she cared about. She thought about the little girl at the table with the dictionary. Then she thought about that email. She's left with just the photo. Her anger wasn't loud. It was cold. Clean. "We're not walking away quietly," she said at last. Lena's eyebrows rose slightly. "We're not?" Marcus asked. "No," Amora replied. "If we walk away without saying why, they'll do this to someone else. Someone who doesn't read Spanish. Someone who trusts their word. This isn't just about us. It's about a pattern." Evelyn nodded slowly. "So what's your plan?" And this is where Amora changed. Up until then, she'd been reacting, taking hits, absorbing insults, adjusting course. But in that moment, she shifted from defense to offense. This was the moment she stopped being their target and became their strategist. She spoke clearly. "First, we keep talking. We don't let them know we've seen the Spanish discrepancies yet. We act exactly how they expect us to act, excited, cooperative, eager. Let them feel safe." "Isn't that risky?" Marcus asked. "Everything about this deal is risky now," she answered. "But we're not going to play their game without a net. We'll gather evidence. Every version, every email, every meeting where they say something on the assumption we don't understand." She turned to Lena. "Record the audio of any in-person meetings where it's legal. Take detailed notes. Get everything in writing. If they speak in Spanish, note the time. I'll translate later." Then to Marcus. "Have our local counsel in Spain and Mexico go through every Spanish-language document with a fine-tooth comb. No shortcuts, no assumptions. If they refuse to provide originals or delay, log it." "And then?" Evelyn asked. "And then," Amara said, "we choose the right moment. Somewhere public enough that they can't pretend it was all a misunderstanding. Somewhere with witnesses who matter." She looked at the Northbridge logo printed on the glass door. "We expose the pattern. On our terms. Calmly. Factually. With receipts." Evelyn smiled slowly. "Remind me never to underestimate you." "Get in line," Amora replied with a dry little laugh. "A lot of people are about to regret doing that." From that day on, every email she answered, every smile she gave, every polite nod on video calls was calculated. She was not just an investor anymore. She was building a case. Weeks turned into a carefully controlled dance. Velasco Dynamics thought they were leading. They scheduled meetings, sent glossy presentations, and kept talking about shared values and long-term partnership. They continued sending contracts in English, with a polite note, original Spanish version available upon request. Of course, Amara requested. Every time. Quietly, without comment. In one virtual meeting, they had a mixed language call. Some Spanish, some English. They assumed the interpreters would filter everything. At one point, when the formal presentations ended, two of the executives began chatting in Spanish as they waited for someone to share a screen. "La verdad es que después del tercer año podemos sacarla del concilio con esa cláusula," one said. "Nadie va a llorar por ella. Es solo un símbolo." The truth is, after year 3, we can kick her off the board with that clause. No one will cry for her. She's just a symbol. "Pero numbers va haber muchas puertas y en Estados Unidos," the other replied. "Que numbers aguant hasta entonces." "But she'll open a lot of doors for us in the U.S. Let her endure us until then." Amara sat perfectly still, her face neutral in her Zoom window. "Amara, can you hear us?" one of the English-speaking members asked, not realizing their colleague's conversation was still audible. "Yes," she replied smoothly. "Loud and clear." She meant it. After that call, She had Northbridge's IT team preserve recordings. Legal reviewed them. They built a file, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. Emails, contracts, transcripts. And the more they gathered, the more clear it became. This wasn't some small misunderstanding. It was a sophisticated attempt to secure capital and image while preserving control. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. Finally, after months of negotiations, a date was set. The official signing ceremony. It would take place in Alejandro's flagship headquarters, in a gleaming tower overlooking the city. Press were invited. Key investors, government officials, industry leaders. It would be broadcasted. Live. The perfect stage. For him and for her. In the days leading up to the event, Alejandro's team grew increasingly confident. They ironed out the final wording of the English-language press releases. They prepared speeches talking about historic partnership and breaking barriers. Privately, their Spanish-language internal memos told a different story. Una vez que cierren, preparamos la reestructuración. Once they close, we'll prepare the restructuring. Ella puede quedarse en el consejo un tiempo. No hay prisa para sacarla. She can stay on the board for a while. No rush to remove her. They weren't worried. Why would they be? Everything looked perfect from the outside. On the morning of the signing, Amara stood in front of a hotel mirror adjusting her blazer. Her mother's voice played in her head. Remember whose name you carry. She picked up her phone and called. Mom, I'm about to go in. Her mother's voice crackled through. I'm praying for you. Not for the money. For your peace. Don't sell your soul for any contract. You hear me? I hear you, Amara said, swallowing the tightness in her throat. She hung up, took a deep breath, and walked out. In the car, Lena sat next to her, scrolling through last-minute notes. Everything set. Amara asked, contracts printed? Check. Spanish originals? Check. Email translations? Check. Our statement, in case we need it? Check, Lena replied. They exchanged a look. Both knew. Today could go in two very different directions. They either walked out richer and complicit, or poorer and free. Maybe you've had a moment like that in your own life, not with billions on the line, but with your integrity, a choice nobody else can really make for you. This was hers. Now we're back in that glass room. Cameras setting up, assistants moving around, journalists testing their recorders. Everyone was in place. Alejandro walked in, all smiles, shaking hands, greeting officials. He hugged Amara for the cameras, whispered into her ear in English, "This is going to change the world." She smiled politely. The formal ceremony hadn't started yet, but microphones were already live, quietly picking up ambient audio. That's standard in events like this to monitor sound levels. Alejandro didn't know that. Or maybe he forgot. He sat down. His board members flanked him. Amara sat opposite, Northbridge representatives beside her. For a moment, there was a lull, a pause before the host officially opened the event. Alejandro leaned back, angled his head toward his board members, and in Spanish, with a smack, said the line that would crack everything open. Tranquilos. Dejen la sonrisa para las cámaras. Cuando el dinero entra, la mandemos a la mesa de los niños. Solo la necesitamos por la foto. Nadie la vaya a tomar en serios. Relax. Let her smile for the cameras. Once the money comes in, we'll send her to the kids' table. We only need her for the photo. No one is going to take her seriously. They chuckled. One of them added, "Sai, y luego la saquemos del consejo con la cláusula de reestructuración. Todo esto en el contrato y en español." Yes, and then we remove her from the board with the restructuring clause. It's all in the Spanish contract. That was it. The room didn't go quiet because most people didn't understand. Not yet. But Amara did. She could have ignored it. She could have stored it in her chest with all the other hurts and smiled for the cameras anyway. Instead, she made a choice. She straightened her back, turned her head toward Alejandro, and addressed him in Spanish, clearly, her voice carrying farther than he expected. "Este seguro, Señor Velasco. Porque en mi version del contrato. Nadie me manda a la mesa de los niños. Y cuando escuchen lo que acaba de decir, Dudo que alguien lo vuelva a tomar en serio a usted. Are you sure, Mr. Velasco? Because in my version of the contract, nobody sends me to the kids' table. And when they hear what you just said, I doubt anyone will ever take you seriously again. His smile died. The board members froze. A few journalists looked up, startled by the sudden shift in tone. The event coordinator at the back instinctively raised a hand to her headset. And then Amara did something that would make this moment impossible to bury. She turned, still speaking Spanish, but louder now, addressing the room. Para queens no hablan español. Permítame introduce lo que su CEO acaba de decir sobre mí y sobre este acuerdo. For those who don't speak Spanish, allow me to translate what your CEO just said about me and about this deal. The event host, flustered, tried to interject. Ms. Johnson, perhaps we can. No, she said calmly, switching to English now. If we're going to sign a $10 billion deal, everyone deserves to know the truth. And then, clearly, without drama, she translated Alejandro's words into English. Relax. Let her smile for the cameras. Once the money comes in, we'll send her to the kids' table. We only need her for the photo. No one is going to take her seriously. The words hung in the air like smoke. You could feel the mood shift. Some people looked at Alejandro, waiting for him to deny it, to claim a misunderstanding. He opened his mouth. This is a misinterpretation, he stammered. I was joking, in a private. In a room full of live microphones, Amara cut in. And it's not just a joke. It's a pattern. She nodded to Lena, who handed her a folder. Amara stood, not angrily, but with the quiet authority of someone who knows they are done being played. We came into this partnership in good faith, she said, addressing the room. We believed in the tech, the potential, the impact. We still do. But impact without integrity is just exploitation. She opened the folder. In the Spanish version of the contract your team sent us, there's a clause that would allow Velasco Dynamics to dilute our stake and remove us from the board after the third year under vague market conditions. She showed both documents to the nearest camera. English on one side, Spanish on the other. In English, that clause doesn't pay. In internal emails, written in Spanish, your executives bragged about how, and I quote, if Northbridge doesn't notice the difference, perfect. We secure control after year 3 and she's left with just the photo. A murmur rippled through the room. Journalists started typing furiously. Cameras zoomed in. Phones were discreetly lifted for recordings. Alejandro's face turned ashen. Our legal team, our analysts, and our translators have spent the last few weeks documenting every difference, every manipulative phrase, every internal message you assumed we wouldn't understand. She looked directly at him. You didn't just underestimate me. You underestimated everyone you said you cared about in all your speeches about inclusion and diversity. He tried again. We can discuss this privately. She shook her head. We could, she said. But then you'd walk into another room like this, with another investor who doesn't speak your language, and do the exact same thing. She closed the folder. So I'm going to make this very simple. She turned to the audience, to the cameras, to the watchers at home. Northbridge Capital is withdrawing from this deal. Effective immediately. Gasps. This signing is cancelled. There will be no $10 billion partnership today. Not with these terms. Not with this leadership. Not when respect is treated as optional fine print instead of the foundation. She placed the unsigned contract on the table. And if any regulator, journalist, or stakeholder wants to see exactly what we found, the discrepancies, the emails, the recordings, our legal team will be more than happy to cooperate. Her voice didn't shake once. This is business, she finished. Not a photo shoot. I refuse to be anyone's quota, anyone's symbol, or anyone's silent partner in deceit. Then she sat down. The silence that followed was deafening. Alejandro's lawyers scrambled. One of the board members whispered urgently in his ear. The event coordinator received frantic instructions in her headset. But the damage was done, because somewhere in that room, a red light blinked on a camera that had caught everything. And about 10 minutes later, clips of a black investor responding in fluent Spanish, exposing a billionaire CEO, started making their way online. You can't humiliate someone in public, mock their intelligence, and attempt to quietly cheat them out of power, and expect life to stay the same when they refuse to play along. Within hours, a major financial news network ran the clip under a blunt headline. Billionaire CEO accused of deception and racist remarks in failed $10 billion deal. Shares of Velasco Dynamics began to slide. At first, Alejandro tried to control the narrative. His PR team released a statement calling it a language misunderstanding and claiming the contract differences were technical misalignments. But more information kept coming out. Regulators requested the Spanish and English versions of the contracts. Northbridge's legal team cooperated fully. An internal leak from Velasco Dynamics sent a few of those incriminating emails to journalists. Investors did not like what they saw. Large funds began questioning not just the ethics, but the governance of the company. If they were willing to play fast and loose with a partner like Northbridge, what were they doing with everyone else? Within a week, the company lost billions in market cap. Analysts who used to praise Alejandro's genius now questioned his judgment. Behind closed doors, his board panicked. One evening, in a quiet emergency meeting, they asked him to step out of the room. When he came back, they informed him he was being transitioned out as CEO for the good of the company. He tried to fight it. He pointed to his record, his innovations, everything he'd built. But in the end, money talks. And money was saying, "We can't afford you anymore." He resigned. On the other side, Northbridge took a short-term hit. Some people thought walking away from $10 billion was reckless. Comment sections filled with opinions. Why make it about race? Some wrote. She should have just signed and worked from inside. Others argued. Business is business. Grow thicker skin, a few said. But others saw it clearly. They saw a system that was used to exploiting partnerships while keeping real power in the same old hands. They saw a woman who chose integrity over profit. And over time, it was that narrative that stuck. A year later, Amara stood on a different stage. Not in a glass tower owned by a tech conglomerate, but at a global ethics and finance conference. On a large screen behind her, the title of her keynote glowed. Language, Power, and the Price of Underestimation. The room was full, young professionals, seasoned executives, activists, students, regulators. She spoke about contracts and clauses, about the importance of multilingual transparency in global deals, about how too many companies use complexity as a shield to hide bad faith. But she also spoke about something more personal. I grew up translating for my parents at doctor's appointments and bank meetings. She said, I watched systems rely on confusion to maintain control. That's why I learned languages. Not to impress anyone. To protect us. She glanced around the room. Last year, when a CEO assumed I didn't understand what he was saying about me in Spanish, he didn't just underestimate my education. He underestimated my history, my community, and the people who taught me to pay attention. After the failed deal with Velasco Dynamics, Northbridge had redirected its capital. They partnered with a different company, one with transparent governance, led by people who were willing to put integrity into the actual fine print. It wasn't as flashy. The headlines weren't as big. But the impact, real. Solar grids in communities that had been off the map. Tech training programs for young people who had never touched a computer. Broadband in rural towns. Jobs that actually paid living wages. It didn't erase the hurt of what happened. But it gave the pain somewhere to go. It turned it into direction. As for Alejandro, he still had money. Men like him almost always do. But his influence had shrunk. He was no longer invited to speak about inclusion on panels. His name became a cautionary tale in business schools. The clip of him being calmly exposed in front of the entire world stayed online. A permanent reminder, not of his joke, of her answer. So, what is this story really about? On the surface, it's about a billionaire CEO who joked in Spanish about a black investor and lost a $10 billion deal when she answered him in his own language. But underneath, it's about underestimation. It's about those moments when people smile to your face and mock you when they think you can't hear. When systems are built on the assumption that you won't read the fine print, won't ask questions, won't understand what's being said about you. It's about how power often hides in language. In the clauses nobody translates. In the jokes people call harmless. In the side conversations, they assume you're too naive to decode. And it's about what happens when someone like Amara says, "No, I hear you. I understand you. And I refuse to play my assigned role." If you've ever been underestimated, you know how this feels. If you've ever walked into a room and seen the surprise in people's faces when you open your mouth, you know. If you've ever had someone talk over you, ignore your expertise, or treat you like decoration instead of a decision maker, you know. Here's the thing. You don't always get a microphone in a glass room. You don't always get a viral clip. Most of the time, your moments of courage happen quietly. In emails, in small meetings, in conversations nobody records. But they matter. Because every time you refuse to shrink yourself to fit somebody else's disrespect, you're rewriting the story. Your story. And maybe somebody else's too. So if you're watching this right now, let me talk to you for a second. If you've ever sat in a room and felt that knot in your chest because you knew something wasn't right. If you've ever been told you're overreacting when all you did was notice a pattern. If you've ever been the only one of your kind in a space that was never designed for you. Remember this. Your awareness is not a weakness. Your ability to understand, to see through the joke, to read between the lines, that is your power. Learn the languages people think you won't understand. Not just Spanish or French, but legal language, financial language, tech language. The systems they use to keep power can become the tools you use to challenge it. And if you believe that integrity matters more than income, that respect matters more than reputation, and that real partnership can't exist without honesty, you're not alone. There are more Amaras in this world than there are Alejandros. More people who've had enough of being the token, the quota, the symbol. If this story hit you in a personal place, if it reminded you of something you lived through or are still going through, do me a favor. Drop a comment and share which part of this story resonated with you the most. Hit the like button so more people who need to hear stories like this can find it. And if you want more true-to-life stories about power, betrayal, justice, and the quiet courage it takes to stand your ground in a world that keeps underestimating you, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because somewhere right now, someone is being underestimated in a room they worked their entire life to enter. And one day, they're going to answer back. Maybe in Spanish. Maybe in contracts. Maybe just in the way they decide to walk away. When that moment comes, I want you to remember this story. And remember that your voice, your understanding, and your integrity can be worth more than any $10 billion deal.